I stepped out from behind the pillar and every eye turned to me. Confused murmurs filled the ballroom. Adelaide froze, her face white as ice. I climbed the steps to the stage and took the microphone from her hand. "Hi," I said, my voice steady. "I'm Ryan Shepherd, the warehouse worker, the guy holding my wife back. That company you all work for, Summit Manufacturing, I own it. Every warehouse, every factory, every single share. It's mine." Silence slammed the room. The laughter stopped. The applause died mid-clap. Adelaide's sharp, panicked laugh rang out, but no one joined her. Austin Hampton, the CEO, looked like he'd been punched in the gut. And in that moment, the truth hit everyone like a hurricane. Nothing, not a single assumption, had been real.
I didn't wake up one morning knowing my life was about to split open. It started the way most collapses do, quietly, with something so small it barely registered as suspicion, just a thin hairline fracture in what I believed was a solid reality, a moment where a sentence landed wrong, where a reaction came half a second too late, where the tone didn't match the words. And I remember dismissing it at first, because that's what you do when the world you've built still feels safer than the truth trying to push its way in. So I told myself I was tired, distracted, projecting. But the fracture didn't close. It widened slowly, invisibly. And over the next few weeks, I began to notice patterns that shouldn't exist if everything was honest. Conversations that looped without resolution. Financial explanations that were technically correct but emotionally hollow. Stories that aligned in structure yet differed in detail depending on when they were told. And none of it was enough to accuse, not even enough to confront, but it was enough to change how I listened, how I watched, how I calibrated silence. Because once doubt enters, even politely, it rewrites your posture in the world. And I didn't lean forward or lash out. I leaned back, mentally, letting the surface remain calm while something underneath started mapping. Not aggressively, not desperately, just attentively. Like a man who has learned that storms don't announce themselves with thunder, but with pressure shifts you feel in your bones before the sky changes color. And what unsettled me most wasn't the possibility of betrayal. It was how effortlessly everything still looked normal from the outside, how laughter arrived on cue, how routines stayed intact, how affection remained performative and therefore convincing, which told me that if something was wrong, it wasn't chaotic or impulsive, it was controlled, rehearsed. And that realization changed the stakes instantly, because chaos can be confronted, but control has to be studied. And so I began doing something that felt unnatural at first. I stopped seeking reassurance and started collecting alignment. Not proof, not evidence, just alignment between words, actions, timing, and incentives. Because lies don't collapse under pressure, they collapse under consistency. And I needed time for that. Patience, restraint, the kind of stillness that looks like trust to the person being observed. And during this period, I didn't feel heroic or clever. I felt exposed, almost embarrassed by how long it had taken me to notice the fracture at all. And yet that embarrassment hardened into resolve, because whatever this was, it wasn't going to be solved by confrontation or emotion or hope. It was going to be solved by clarity. And clarity requires distance, and distance requires discipline. And so I began to compartmentalize. My reactions stayed the same, my routines stayed predictable, my presence stayed reliable, but internally I marked moments, logged inconsistencies, and trained myself not to flinch when something didn't add up, because flinching teaches the other person where to adjust, and I wasn't ready for adjustments yet. I needed the pattern to reveal itself fully. And by the time I realized how long this fracture might have existed before I noticed it, I understood something crucial. Whatever was happening wasn't new, only my awareness was. And awareness, once activated, doesn't sleep. It waits, it watches, and it prepares. And what Sylvia didn't know yet was that I wasn't reacting to a sudden betrayal. I was finally recognizing the outline of something that had been forming quietly for months, and that I had already begun, without panic or confrontation, to prepare for the moment when the fracture would inevitably become a break. Once the fracture revealed itself, the instinct to speak surged hard and fast, because confrontation feels like control when uncertainty starts tightening around your chest. But I resisted it deliberately, not out of fear, but out of respect for how power actually works. Because the moment you ask a question you aren't ready to verify, you surrender leverage you didn't even know you had. So instead of demanding answers, I chose silence. Not passive silence, not withdrawal, but an active, calibrated quiet that let the world continue exactly as it was while I shifted how I interpreted it. And this was harder than any argument would have been, because silence doesn't give you relief, it gives you responsibility. It forces you to sit with unresolved tension and trust that patience will pay dividends later. And during this phase, I began to notice how often people reveal themselves when they believe the performance is no longer being judged, how explanations become looser, timelines stretch, justifications soften, not because they think you're ignorant, but because they think you're comfortable. And comfort breeds carelessness, so I became comfortable on purpose, nodding when expected, agreeing when safe, never pushing back hard enough to provoke recalibration, because recalibration is the enemy of observation. And slowly the environment began to talk without realizing it was being listened to. Small things first, changes in schedule framed as convenience, financial decisions explained as efficiency, emotional distance disguised as stress, and none of it was damning in isolation, but together it formed a rhythm, a tempo that didn't match the official story being presented. And what mattered wasn't what was happening, it was how predictably it was happening. Because deception isn't random, it follows incentives, and incentives leave fingerprints in behavior long before they leave evidence on paper. And so I trained myself to ask a different set of questions internally. Not, is this true, but who benefits if this is believed, and what behavior does this explanation protect? And that shift reframed everything, because suddenly inconsistencies stopped feeling confusing and started feeling instructive, like markers placed unintentionally along a route I hadn't known existed. And still, I said nothing, because speaking would have satisfied emotion but disrupted data, and data was now the priority. Not because I wanted revenge or dominance, because I understood that once silence is broken, the system adapts, and I wasn't studying chaos, I was studying a system that functions smoothly, precisely because it had never been challenged. And the more I watched, the clearer it became that any premature confrontation would collapse the opportunity to understand the full scope of what I was dealing with. And this is where most people fail. They mistake the relief of expression for resolution. They trade long-term clarity for short-term validation, and I refused to make that trade, even if it meant swallowing reactions that burned to escape. Because restraint is not the absence of emotion, it's the discipline to decide when emotion is useful. And at this stage, it wasn't. What was useful was letting patterns mature, letting narratives stretch until they contradicted themselves, letting confidence grow unchecked, because unchecked confidence produces the cleanest mistakes. And during this period, something else changed quietly inside me. The anxiety that usually accompanies uncertainty began to drain away, replaced by a colder, steadier focus, not because the situation improved, but because I stopped needing it to. Once you accept that truth will arrive on its own schedule if you stop interfering with it, you stop panicking about timing. And that acceptance gave me an unexpected advantage, because while nothing outward had shifted, inwardly I had moved from participant to observer. And an observer doesn't rush, an observer waits, knowing that silence properly used doesn't weaken your position, it sharpens it. And by the end of this phase, the silence was no longer a tactic, it had become a filter, separating what was said from what was meant, and quietly preparing me for the moment when observation would no longer be enough. Silence eventually gives way to recognition, not in a dramatic flash, but in a slow, unsettling accumulation of moments that refuse to stay isolated. And by the time I reached this phase, I understood that I was no longer collecting impressions, I was identifying patterns, which is a far more dangerous thing, because impressions can be dismissed as feelings, but patterns demand explanation. And this is where the story stopped being about suspicion and started becoming about structure. Because when behaviors repeat under different conditions, yet produce the same outcome, you're no longer witnessing coincidence, you're seeing design. And once I framed it that way, everything rearranged itself. The late nights were no longer about work, they followed a predictable cadence. The financial decisions weren't impulsive, they clustered around specific windows of time. The emotional distance didn't ebb and flow, it appeared and vanished in sync with external events that had nothing to do with stress or fatigue. And what unsettled me most wasn't the deception itself, it was how consistent it was, how efficiently it conserved effort. because consistency reveals intention, and intention reveals planning, and that realization forced me to recalibrate my role again. Because if someone is operating within a structure, confronting them emotionally doesn't disrupt the structure, it reinforces it by validating their assumptions about your predictability. So instead of reacting, I began mapping, mentally at first, then deliberately, tracking sequences rather than incidents, cause and effect rather than explanations. And I noticed how often truth tried to surface indirectly, through overcorrection, through unnecessary justifications, through details volunteered too quickly or withheld too carefully. Because lies aren't fragile when they're new, they're fragile when they've been carried too long. And the longer the pattern persisted, the more it relied on my continued acceptance to remain stable, which created a quiet tension I could feel even when nothing was being said. A tension that showed up in subtle vigilance, in checks disguised as concern, in questions framed casually but delivered with precision. And that told me something important. Awareness was asymmetrical. I was observing freely, but I was also being measured, not for what I knew, but for how much I suspected. And that sharpened my restraint even further, because once someone starts monitoring your reactions, every reaction becomes data they can adjust against. So I minimized noise, kept responses flat, predictable, boring, because boredom is disarming. It signals safety, and safety encourages continuity, and continuity is what patterns require to remain visible. And as the weeks passed, the pattern stopped expanding and started looping, repeating itself with minor variations, which is often the final stage before exposure, because systems that believe they're unseen grow lazy, they stop innovating and start recycling, and that's when their blind spots widen and mine narrowed, because now I wasn't just...
The moment I realized I was no longer free came quietly, without confrontation or drama. And that was what unsettled me most, because nothing in my environment had changed, and yet every internal calculation suddenly carried weight. Awareness had crossed a threshold and turned into obligation, and once that happened, observation stopped being passive and started demanding discipline, restraint, and silence I hadn't anticipated. Until then, watching had felt like power, an edge I could sharpen in private. But now each new insight closed doors instead of opening them, because knowing more meant I had to behave differently, slower, flatter, cleaner, as if every casual action could ripple outward and reveal the shape of what I was building beneath the surface. I began to notice how even neutral behavior could become suspicious if repeated too precisely, how consistency itself could expose intent. And that realization forced me to limit my movements, my questions, even my reactions, not because I was afraid of being caught doing something wrong, but because being seen thinking would be enough to alter the terrain. There were moments I wanted to confront, to test, to provoke a response just to see how far the truth stretched, but restraint became mandatory, and restraint has a cost when your instincts are trained to act. Every impulse had to be logged and denied, every emotional spike suppressed, because emotion accelerates behavior, and acceleration creates patterns. The strangest part was how isolation crept in, not imposed from outside, but self-selected. Because once you understand the dynamics at play, you can't unsee them, and sharing even fragments of that understanding risks distortion or premature exposure. So silence becomes not just a tactic, but a boundary, separating you from people who still move freely within assumptions you no longer trust. Sleep thinned, not from fear, but from rehearsal, as my mind ran scenarios where a single misplaced word or poorly timed curiosity collapsed months of quiet preparation. And that mental repetition revealed something uncomfortable. The system rewards those who move invisibly, but it punishes those who hesitate visibly, and hesitation was now my greatest liability. I stopped asking for clarification on things I already understood, stopped reacting to inconsistencies I could explain too easily, stopped seeking confirmation where confirmation would require attention, and in doing so, I felt the subtle erosion of normalcy, because pretending not to know is harder than ignorance. It requires constant calibration.
What I hadn't expected was the moral friction, the way prolonged concealment begins to test your self-image, not because you're lying, but because you're choosing not to correct falsehoods that benefit your position, and that choice leaves residue. I wasn't crossing lines yet, but I was standing close enough to feel their heat, aware that once strategy demands sacrifice, neutrality becomes an illusion. The danger wasn't discovery, it was containment tightening around me as the price of control, because every layer of preparation added another rule I had to follow, another constraint I couldn't break without consequence. And slowly I understood the truth that no amount of intelligence training prepares you for. Once you see the whole board, you're no longer a player who can improvise. You're a piece that must move exactly when the moment arrives, not early, not late, and never twice in the same way. Because from this point forward, the greatest risk wasn't what I didn't know, it was acting like I still had the freedom to learn out loud.
5. By the fifth phase, restraint stopped feeling like discipline and started feeling like erosion, because nothing dramatic was happening, yet everything was narrowing, and the danger was no longer hypothetical but cumulative, built from small pressures that individually meant nothing and collectively changed the terrain beneath my feet. Each day without movement was framed as safety, but I could feel the price accumulating in less visible ways. Delayed responses that used to be immediate, access points that quietly required additional verification, conversations that shifted tone without shifting content, all of it subtle enough to dismiss, yet consistent enough to map, and once mapped, impossible to ignore. This wasn't confrontation or exposure, but it was constraint, the kind that doesn't announce itself as force, but as process, and that distinction mattered, because process doesn't need justification, it only needs momentum. I began to understand that the system wasn't waiting for me to act, it was testing how long I would tolerate compression without reacting, how much narrowing could occur before I mistook endurance for control. The psychological strain of that realization was sharper than fear, because fear responds to threat, while this demanded calibration under ambiguity, and ambiguity is where mistakes are manufactured. Every instinct said, hold, preserve optionality, don't introduce variables. But that logic assumed the environment was static, when in fact it was adapting around me, recalibrating with each day I remained inert, and adaptation, once complete, hardens into expectation. The cost of stillness, then, wasn't immediate loss, but future inflexibility, the slow closing of paths I hadn't chosen to abandon, and that forced a reevaluation of restraint itself, whether it was still strategic or had become a passive concession masquerading as patience. What made this phase dangerous wasn't pressure alone, but the illusion of neutrality, because nothing in motion-free space stays neutral, it either decays or gets claimed. I noticed how easily inaction could be reframed by others, not as caution, but as acquiescence, and that reframing, once established, would dictate how any later move was interpreted, not as assertion, but as disruption. That awareness introduced a new kind of urgency, quieter but heavier, because the longer I waited, the more any eventual action would appear reactionary rather than deliberate, and reaction is always weaker than intention. This was the moment where internal calibration reached its limit, where thinking further didn't produce better answers, but diminishing clarity, and I realized that the system was no longer testing my awareness, but my tolerance for loss without acknowledgement. Staying still was no longer free. It was extracting something intangible but real, agency, narrative control, future leverage, and the absence of visible threat was itself the mechanism by which that extraction occurred. I hadn't acted yet, but I could see the shape of the next requirement forming, the quiet demand that would soon arrive framed as routine compliance, and I understood that when it did, refusing or agreeing would both carry consequences that couldn't be undone. This phase wasn't about action yet, it was about recognizing that inaction had crossed from strategy into exposure, that waiting had become a position others could exploit, and that the corridor ahead no longer allowed indefinite delay.
By the end of this module, the audience should feel what I felt then. Not impatience, not fear, but the tightening certainty that holding ground was no longer neutral, that pressure had become directional, and that the next phase would not ask whether to move, only where and at what cost.
The shift didn't announce itself as courage or defiance. It arrived as necessity, because by the time movement becomes urgent, it no longer feels like choice. And that was the quiet truth settling in as I recognized that holding position had turned into a liability others could measure. The first move wasn't dramatic, and that was intentional, because overt action invites immediate reaction, while subtle commitment tests the system without declaring war, and what I needed now wasn't attention, but confirmation. I chose a single controlled deviation, small enough to appear procedural, deliberate enough to be irreversible once completed, and the moment it was set in motion, the environment responded in ways that observation alone never provoked. Timelines shifted. A routine acknowledgement arrived faster than expected, followed by a clarification request that hadn't existed before, and in that narrow sequence, I saw proof of what restraint had been shielding me from. The system wasn't dormant, it was watching, waiting for something to orient against. To make the change tangible, I adjusted a single lever in the control room, a tiny red switch that governed the sequencing of the production line. Nobody would notice it, yet once it moved, the line would operate in a pattern that couldn't be reversed without shutting everything down. That small click echoed louder in my mind than any grand declaration, because it meant the act was real, measurable, permanent. The psychological weight of that realization was heavier than fear, because fear dissipates once a threat is named, while consequence demands ownership. You act, and the outcome is now partly yours. What made this moment decisive wasn't the scale of the move, but the loss of plausible deniability. I had crossed a threshold where returning to pure observation was no longer possible, because the act itself created a trace, and traces change narratives. The system now had a reference point, and so did I, and in that shared awareness, the dynamic shifted from waiting to testing, from compression to calibration under motion. I noticed how quickly neutrality evaporated once movement began, how fast the language around me adapted to accommodate the new reality, not hostile yet, but no longer indifferent, and that subtle change confirmed what restraint had hidden. Action doesn't escalate danger as much as it clarifies alignment. The cost, however, was immediate and internal. Doubt surged not about whether the move was correct, but whether it had been delayed too long. Because once you act, you retroactively reinterpret every moment you didn't, and that recalibration can destabilize resolve if you let it. I forced myself not to spiral into that backward accounting, because hesitation after commitment is more damaging than hesitation before it, and the discipline now was to stay present with the consequences as they unfolded, not rush ahead to imagined outcomes. What mattered was that the system had responded, not aggressively, not overtly, but distinctly, and that response confirmed that the corridor I'd been navigating blindly now had measurable walls. This was the break in pattern the situation demanded, not exposure, not confrontation, but confirmation through controlled risk, a move that carried cost without catastrophe, and in doing so, reset the balance from endurance to engagement. By the end of this phase, it was clear that waiting was no longer the default posture, because the environment had acknowledged my presence, and once acknowledged, presence becomes participation whether you like it or not. The audience should feel that shift here, not relief, not triumph, but the sober recognition that something irreversible has begun, that the story has crossed from internal pressure into external consequence, and that whatever comes next will no longer ask whether action is required, only whether it will be timed well enough to preserve what remains.
The system had been patient with me, or at least it seemed so, but I knew the quiet tension was reaching its limit. The air was thick with unspoken anticipation, each decision I deferred now carrying weight beyond calculation. It wasn't enough to think, to plan, To hold my position, I needed the first subtle test, a move small enough to seem routine, but precise enough to reveal cracks. I started with a simple redirection of a key task. A team member's assignment was shifted just slightly, a minor change on paper, yet the effect was immediate and observable. Confused glances, whispered corrections, a brief collision of schedules that forced two managers into an awkward negotiation over priorities. In the cafeteria, colleagues' eyes flickered with uncertainty as rumors began to seed themselves in tiny, almost imperceptible ripples. The energy of the room shifted, not dramatically, but undeniably. I watched each reaction with a detached intensity, noting how small gestures, a tightened jaw, a subtle pause in speech, a hand hovering uncertainly over a report, betrayed the growing pressure. Emotion, usually hidden behind protocol and routine, now leaked through micro-events. A subordinate's hesitation when asking a question, a supervisor's sharp inhale when double-checking numbers, the subtle quiver of impatience in someone used to certainty. I allowed myself to show a single, measured reaction to a minor error, a furrowed brow, a restrained sigh, not enough to alarm, but enough to signal that control came at a cost. And then the first domino fell. A missed shipment notice triggered a sudden scramble, calls pinged across departments, and a normally calm manager barked orders in a voice that shook just slightly, betraying the tension under the surface. This wasn't chaos, it was evidence, proof that the carefully structured system I'd observed for weeks was now reactive, malleable, vulnerable to subtle nudges. The stakes, though still under the surface, were now tangible, and each ripple of consequence carried emotional weight. Uncertainty, fear of error, and the first taste of accountability that no one could fully ignore. Every action and inaction now mattered, each decision sending currents through the network of relationships, behaviors, and expectations. The audience should feel both the internal calculation and the external pressure. Strategy now manifests in real-world consequences, and restraint has a visible price. The tension builds not with spectacle, but through meticulously observed cause and effect, the system revealing itself in micro-events that signal larger shifts to come. Module 7 closes on the cusp of escalation. The tipping point has arrived, subtle but undeniable, preparing the viewer for the next phase where restraint must yield to decisive, irreversible motion. The emotional resonance is quiet but sharp. Anxiety, anticipation, and the weight of consequence are now inescapable. No dramatic explosions, no overt confrontation, just the first visible tremors in a system that had seemed stable, signaling that the path forward will carry cost, risk, and unavoidable engagement. Every minor reaction is amplified, every glance measured, every hesitation noted. The audience now understands the gravity of choice, and the stakes of inaction have never been clearer.
8. The patience of observation had ended. The quiet corridors of calculation were now a battleground where every action carried weight, and I could no longer remain invisible in the system I had studied for weeks. I chose my first move carefully, not a grand gesture, but a measured strike with tangible effect. I sent a seemingly routine directive to the operations team, rerouting a shipment of critical components to a secondary warehouse, and immediately observed the chain reaction. Alarms sounded in small, clipped phone calls, mid-level managers debated logistics in hushed tones, and the first real cracks appeared in the facade of competence I had long admired. In the control room, monitors pinged with errors that were technically insignificant, yet the team's hesitation turned minor adjustments into a tense, nervous choreography of missteps, revealing both vulnerability and overconfidence. I allowed myself to linger in the shadows, noting the subtle tremor in the voice of the supervisor reporting the discrepancy, the almost imperceptible tapping of fingers on desks, the fleeting looks exchanged between colleagues that carried more meaning than any spoken word. Emotions surged quietly through the room: anxiety, frustration, fear of failing, and the realization that oversight could no longer shield anyone from consequence. Every small decision now echoed through the system, and I made sure each ripple was visible without being overtly alarming. A spilled report here, a misfiled document there, the gentle pressure that exposed the first signs of error and hesitation. Then came the first confrontation. A team member challenged the rerouting, citing protocol, and for the first time I interjected, not with authority, but with subtle persuasion, asking questions that forced them to confront discrepancies they had previously ignored. The shift was immediate. Doubt replaced certainty, tension replaced routine, and I watched the system react exactly as predicted. Outside the operational flow, whispers began to surface, colleagues noticing small changes, rumors forming quietly but inevitably. The emotional undercurrent thickened: anxiety, curiosity, unease, all born from small calculated interventions that had no immediate spectacle but carried irreversible consequences. I allowed a brief pause between actions, letting the team digest the subtle pressure, understanding that timing was as important as execution. Then I escalated. Another minor disruption, this time targeting communication between two departments whose cooperation was assumed, and observed the resulting friction. Delayed emails, misaligned schedules, quick tempers flaring, and the unmistakable spark of recognition that the status quo was no longer guaranteed. By the end of the day, the first cracks were visible to anyone paying attention: micro errors stacking, tension rising, and the realization dawning that nothing in the system remained untouched. Module 8 closes with a quiet, almost invisible crescendo. The first move has been made, and the consequences, though subtle, are irreversible. The system has reacted, the rules have shifted, and every participant now operates under the shadow of uncertainty. What was once stable is now fragile, and the audience feels both the intellectual satisfaction of seeing strategy unfold and the emotional charge of imminent change. Action has replaced observation, and the stakes have never been higher. Restraint has given way to consequence, and the narrative is primed for escalation that cannot be ignored. Every choice carries cost, every hesitation risk, and every small ripple sets the stage for the next wave of irreversible motion.
The subtle disruptions of the previous day had set the stage, and now the system was no longer just fragile, it was primed for cascading failure. Each micro-error a potential trigger for larger consequences, and I watched intently as the first real dominoes began to fall. Emails went unanswered, deadlines slipped, and minor miscommunications snowballed into operational delays that managers could no longer contain. In the logistics department, a shipment scheduled to leave that morning stalled at the dock because the required paperwork hadn't been filed, a mistake so small it would normally be ignored, yet perfectly timed to reveal gaps in accountability. Supervisors argued over corrective actions, their voices tight with tension, while employees who had once operated confidently now hesitated, second-guessing every step. I moved deliberately among the shadows of observation, noting the human responses: a manager biting his lip as he recalculated production schedules, a technician pacing nervously as he realized his oversight had real consequences, the quiet dread that replaced habitual routine. Outside the immediate operational sphere, the effects rippled further. Clients received delayed notifications, minor contracts were questioned, and internal whispers reached the ears of executives who had believed the system unshakable. The pressure became visible, tangible, a web of tension that expanded exponentially with each small misstep, and I felt the dual satisfaction of strategic precision and the cold thrill of watching the first irreversible results of my interventions take shape. Then came the confrontation I had anticipated,
A senior manager demanded answers, questioning why protocols had failed and who was responsible. I intervened subtly, not with overt authority, but by framing questions that exposed hidden assumptions and blind spots, forcing accountability in real time. Frustration flared, tempers rose, and the subtle emotional shifts I had predicted emerged fully. Fear, anger, defensiveness, and the realization that past habits no longer guaranteed security. Micro-events compounded the effect. A misplaced order triggered a chain reaction in inventory management. A delayed approval stalled production lines. A miscommunicated update led to overlapping assignments that doubled workloads. Each incident alone seemed minor, yet together they painted a vivid picture of vulnerability, and every participant could feel the weight of the cascading system. By mid-afternoon, the domino effect had accelerated. Senior executives noticed discrepancies, urgent calls were made, and the invisible hand of intervention I had applied revealed itself through the chaotic dance of reactions. Emotion intertwined with logic as people tried to stabilize what was now clearly destabilized. Anxiety ran high, decisions were rushed, and the consequences of inaction became unavoidable. I allowed the tension to breathe, resisting the urge to intervene further, letting the system self-reveal its weaknesses, knowing that observation at this stage was as critical as action itself. By evening, patterns emerged. Repeated errors, fragile alliances between departments, and recognition that the chain of failures was no accident but a signal of systemic exposure. The audience senses the irreversible momentum. The first real wave of consequences has landed. The fragile equilibrium is gone, and every choice now carries cost.
13. The morning after the actions I had set into motion, the weight of irreversibility hit me in waves. The legal team confirmed the freeze on Adelaide's accounts. The auditors began scrutinizing every transaction, and my executives were already operating under new directives I had imposed, their loyalty unquestioned but their anxiety palpable. Every corner of Summit Manufacturing was now humming with tension, reflecting the ripple effects of a single day's decisions, and yet it was nothing compared to the personal consequences that awaited me at home, where my children, Asher, Ava, Owen, and Ellie, were processing revelations that would forever alter their perception of family and trust. The DNA results still raw in their minds, the betrayal by their mother mingling with the shock of discovering that I had lived a secret life for decades, and that everything they thought they knew about stability, honesty, and identity was incomplete, forcing me to navigate the delicate balance between providing clarity and shielding them from further emotional harm. I called them together at Morrison's Diner, the same place we had shared meals before, and as they approached the table, their expressions a mixture of disbelief, anger, and confusion, I felt the enormity of my responsibility, knowing that words alone could not undo years of deception, but that silence would be complicity in their pain. So I began speaking carefully, recounting the timeline of truths, of the company ownership, the financial manipulations, and the affair, observing every micro-expression as they absorbed each revelation, noting Asher's fists clenched on the tabletop, Ava's eyes flashing with controlled outrage, Owen's jaw tight with humiliation and fear, and Ellie's small hands gripping her chair, trembling. After the initial storm of questions and accusations, I pivoted to reassure them, emphasizing that while biology could not change, love, choice, and presence defined fatherhood, and that I would remain their parent in every way that mattered, that my commitment to them had never wavered despite the lies that had been necessary to protect them from wealth-driven entitlement. Yet the emotional truth was undeniable. The family unit was fractured. Trust would need to be rebuilt from the foundation up, and the children were now co-owners of a knowledge that carried both power and pain. By midday, I returned to Summit, where the fallout was equally tangible. Executives were anxious, partners called with questions about liquidity and exposure, and I realized that my private reckoning had become a public spectacle, with whispers of scandal beginning to circulate, threatening not only reputation but operational stability.
while the evidence against Adelaide and Austin had begun to galvanize internal accountability, showing who could be trusted and who had been compromised, reinforcing that strategic oversight now intertwined with moral oversight, that leadership was as much about navigating betrayal as it was about efficiency and growth. By evening, my focus returned home as I monitored the children's coping, providing counsel while allowing space for emotion, reminding myself that while legal and corporate battles could be waged with calculated precision, emotional consequences required patience, empathy, and a relentless presence, and that in the coming weeks, every decision I made would reverberate across the family and the company, creating a landscape of cause and effect where control was no longer absolute but negotiated with care. As Module 13 closes on that tension, the understanding that once the first irreversible moves are made, fallout is inevitable, personal and professional boundaries blur, and the narrative momentum shifts entirely from strategy and secrecy to reckoning, reconciliation, and rebuilding, setting the stage for both confrontation and reconstruction in the next modules.
14. The morning light brought no comfort, only the stark clarity that decisions made the night before had set in motion a chain of events that could not be undone. At Summit Manufacturing, the board convened urgently, whispers of Adelaide and Austin's actions already reaching key stakeholders, and I was forced to confront the practical realities of betrayal. The embezzlement, the offshore accounts, the plans to restructure the company to their benefit, all now documented, undeniable, and actionable, while simultaneously, at home, the emotional landscape demanded attention, as my children wrestled with truths that challenged their very understanding of family, identity, and loyalty. And I realized that leadership, whether in business or at the kitchen table, required decisiveness tempered with empathy. So I began the day by isolating the variables I could control, freezing accounts, securing critical company assets, contacting auditors and legal counsel to ensure all evidence was preserved. And at the same time, I drafted a conversation framework for my children to guide them through the reality of their mother's choices, the distinction between actions and love, and the reassurance that despite betrayal, I remained constant. A protector and a father, a presence they could rely on even as the world shifted beneath us. By late morning, I had called a private meeting with Austin Hampton, now visibly worn from nights without sleep, his usual confidence replaced by guilt and fear, and I laid out every piece of evidence, watching as the facade crumbled, as he admitted the truth about financial manipulation, the affair, and the schemes to alter Summit's leadership, while also acknowledging that he had gone along only because of Adelaide's relentless pressure and promises. And in that confession, I found clarity. Strategy without moral clarity had led to destruction, and the responsibility for restoring order rested solely on me. Simultaneously, at home, I sat with the children at Morrison's Diner, answering questions with brutal honesty, describing the financial and personal betrayals, but also emphasizing lessons in integrity, accountability, and the meaning of family beyond biology. Noting how Asher's brow furrowed in determination to understand, Ava's lips pressed tight as she weighed the moral implications, Owen's small frame stiff with a mixture of grief and trust, and Ellie's tears reflecting both confusion and relief at having clarity. And I realized that these moments, painful as they were essential to rebuilding the family's foundation, teaching them to process adversity without losing sight of core values. By afternoon, legal measures were underway. Motions filed to freeze Adelaide's assets, investigative teams mobilized to audit every suspicious transaction, and communication lines established with law enforcement and corporate partners, while at the same time, I coordinated with HR and loyal executives to ensure operational continuity, reassigning key responsibilities to trusted personnel, reinforcing that control of the company would not be left vulnerable, even as the emotional stakes were higher than any financial calculation, because the children's stability, the family's integrity, and the message of accountability could not be compromised for expedience. By evening, the dual fronts, the corporate and the personal, were both moving, each decision echoing across offices and living rooms alike, a tangible reminder that every choice carries cost. And as I drove home, the weight of responsibility pressed down.
Yet within it was a strange relief, the knowledge that honesty, once unleashed, clarified paths that deception had obscured, and that the next steps, though fraught with confrontation, litigation, and emotional reckoning, were no longer uncertain, that Module 14 had transformed hesitation into action, secrecy into disclosure, and vulnerability into deliberate, controlled engagement, setting the stage for final resolution, family rebuilding, and the reestablishment of moral and strategic authority in both life and business.
The courtroom lights were harsh, the smell of polished wood and paper mingling with the tension that had built over months of secrecy, betrayal, and emotional upheaval. And as Adelaide and Austin faced the consequences of their actions, I realized that the legal battle was only a reflection of the personal turmoil we had endured. The embezzlement and conspiracy charges laid bare, the offshore accounts frozen, evidence meticulously documented and presented by my legal team, every fraudulent transaction traced, every collusion exposed, while my children sat quietly in the gallery, absorbing the reality of what had been hidden from them for years. And I knew the stakes extended far beyond money or corporate control. Their understanding of trust, love, and family identity was on the line. As the proceedings unfolded, witnesses testified, emails and letters displayed on the screens, each detail confirming what I had already suspected. The letters between Adelaide and Austin chronicling the affair and strategic manipulation, while the jury listened intently, occasionally exchanging shocked glances. And outside the courtroom, the press swarmed, cameras flashing as reporters tried to capture every expression, every word. Yet I remained focused, compartmentalizing the chaos, because my attention was needed elsewhere as well, with my children, who would soon need guidance to navigate their emotional landscape, to understand that biology did not define our bond, that my love, presence, and commitment to them remained unwavering. And I took that responsibility seriously, scheduling time with each of them, explaining, consoling, listening, and reassuring them that honesty, though painful, was necessary for healing, while simultaneously coordinating with HR and trusted executives to stabilize Summit manufacturing, ensuring operations continued seamlessly, new leadership assignments confirmed, financial safeguards reinforced, and strategic oversight maintained, because corporate recovery could not be delayed, just as emotional recovery could not be neglected. By midweek, the verdicts were rendered. Adelaide found guilty of embezzlement and conspiracy, Austin guilty of aiding and abetting, both facing sentences tempered by restitution agreements and good behavior clauses. Yet the symbolic weight of justice was heavier than the penalties, the restoration of truth resonating more deeply than any prison term, and I allowed myself a brief moment of satisfaction, tempered immediately by the awareness that life outside the courtroom would demand far more effort, that rebuilding trust with my children, reclaiming normalcy, and repairing the fabric of our lives required patience, empathy, and consistency, which I approached deliberately, from family dinners where laughter slowly returned to quiet evenings where heartfelt conversations bridged the gaps left by deceit, to guiding Owen and Ellie through therapy sessions to process identity and loyalty, while Asher and Ava navigated their own sense of morality and justice, discussing fairness, consequences, and the nuances of human behavior, all while maintaining the operational excellence of Summit, now under vigilant oversight, the company thriving again not just because of financial recovery, but because integrity had been restored at the top. And as weeks turned into months, the family slowly adjusted to a life where truth replaced illusion, where open dialogue allowed for vulnerability and growth, where love was redefined by presence and choice rather than secrecy. And by the time the final audits were complete and the company's stability reaffirmed, I understood that Module 15 was not about vengeance or recompense, but about the deliberate reconstruction of both family and empire, the careful stitching together of broken trust, the demonstration that accountability and transparency, though painful, were the foundations on which a stronger, more resilient future could be built, preparing us for a life where honesty, integrity, and connection were no longer optional but essential, and where every decision,
personal or professional, would be guided by the lessons of betrayal, consequence, and the irreplaceable value of those who chose to stay, understand, and grow alongside me. The dust had settled, the courtrooms emptied, the lawsuits filed and resolved, and as I stepped into the quiet of our new home, I finally allowed myself to breathe, feeling the weight of 20 years of secrecy, loyalty, and love slowly lift from my shoulders, replaced by a clarity I had never experienced before. Because for the first time, every facet of my life, family, business, and self, was no longer built on a lie. The children were adapting in ways that filled me with a profound mixture of relief and pride. Asher and Ava planning for college and careers with excitement and resilience. Owen recovering from his accident, yet finding his sense of security restored. Ellie gradually understanding that a father's love transcends biology. And together we laughed, argued over trivial choices like what pizza to order, celebrated small victories, and honored each other's growth, all in ways that redefined what family truly meant. While professionally, Summit Manufacturing thrived under transparent leadership and ethical governance, with Brett Hamilton proving that integrity could coexist with competence, production levels climbing, employee morale high, and the legacy of Shepherd Industries restored not just as a business empire, but as a symbol of accountability, perseverance, and the power of truth. I reflected on the chaos of that night at the Riverside Hotel, on the betrayal, deceit, and lies that had threatened to destroy everything I held dear. And yet, paradoxically, it was through that extreme rupture that clarity, justice, and renewal became possible, teaching me that exposure, though painful, is often the catalyst for transformation, that the hardest truths can lead to the most enduring strength, and the courage to act decisively and honestly, despite fear, anger, or humiliation, is what shapes character. And I realized that my identity, long hidden behind the facade of a simple warehouse worker, was finally free to exist authentically, no longer constrained by pretense or obligation, able to pursue not only success, but purpose. As I returned to the work that had always mattered most to me, helping others, giving back, mentoring, teaching, volunteering, instilling skills and confidence in those who needed it, while also savoring the quiet moments with my children, watching them grow into thoughtful, capable young adults who understood that life is complicated, that mistakes are inevitable, that integrity and love are the foundations that endure. And in that space of honesty, accountability, and openness, I found the extraordinary in the ordinary, a life rebuilt on truth, laughter shared without fear, bonds strengthened by adversity, and the knowledge that betrayal had tested every limit. It could not define the future, because we had chosen differently, and that choice, daily, deliberate, and courageous, would guide us forward. As we embraced every sunrise, every small triumph, every lesson learned, and every connection renewed, forging a life not just recovered, but reborn, a testament to resilience, love, and the unshakable truth that even after the deepest deception, hope, trust, and authenticity can always be reclaimed. And as I looked around at the smiles of my children, the quiet pride of Brett overseeing the factory, and the promise of new projects and initiatives that combined wealth, purpose, and community, I understood that Module 15 was not an ending, but a beginning. A conscious step into a life fully aligned with who I truly was, where secrets no longer dictated my choices, where honesty governed my relationships, and where every moment, every decision, and every heartbeat could finally reflect the man I had been hiding and now was free to be.